and you don't get a chance to see it. Okay? So what I'd like to do today then is get into what we started talking about last class, okay, which is a big question: what is a weed? Okay, and that's why I put these cartoons up here, because basically, well, it really depends on who you're talking to. Okay, so you could have a kid that's looking at crabgrass, and I'll often mention the scientific name just to get you used to it. Okay, so crabgrass is Digitaria, digits, because the inflorescence typically is in 5s. You'll see like a little hand. How many of you know crabgrass? If you see it, you know it. Okay, all of you will know it by the end of this class, and by this afternoon for sure. Okay, here's going to be something you're going to take home. I'm going to know. You might have already seen it. You just don't know what they called it. Okay, Digitaria sanguinalis. We have 2 species: large crabgrass, smooth crabgrass. For those of you in turf, that's a big species. That's a major concern. But also our corn and soybean folks, major concern because the plant germinates late. When we've put down our herbicides and we think we've got it, this thing germinates in mid-June to late June. So it's right now. That's why Scott's, weed and feed, they have a specific, you can purchase crabgrass control, these granulars. That's specific. Dithiopyr is the herbicide, specific to crabgrass. And that's neat because why? What's so unique about that? And it's different from other herbicides in general. It's a grass. You're controlling a grass in turf, which is a grass. Usually we control broadleaf weeds in turf, so dandelion and plantains in turf. Okay, cool, they're broadleafs. This is dicots versus monocots. But here you've got a monocot. And so you're going to be trying to understand why that is, what's going on. Okay, why is it that you have that selectivity? And that's kind of neat about herbicides, that they can be that selective. Not always, but can. Okay, so what's a weed? We talked about last class, some of you said it's a plant that's growing out of place. That's very, very subjective term. And I'll argue that it depends on who you speak to, depending, professionals or not. Okay? There's the general term, a plant out of place. For an agronomist, somebody who's working corn and beans, they'll tell you it's a plant that interferes with or reduces farm productivity in many ways. Okay? Why didn't I just say that it's a plant that reduces yield? Why did I make it so like farm productivity? Why didn't I just say it reduces yield? Which it does.
Because it doesn't always yield like you're growing seed and you could have weed seeds in the seed that you're trying to produce, but it's not necessarily yield, but it's contamination.
Contamination, yes, that's exactly. What else? Exactly. How many of you guys have been combining and you get field bindweed in there? Okay? Or you get weeds that are, you've finally dried down your corn or your soybeans. And again, for some of you, this doesn't mean anything. Don't panic. But those of you who might know, yeah, it means something. You're drying down your corn or your beans, but what do you have? This green weed sitting there that's going to, basically cause problems in terms of drying your grain or your silage. Okay? So that's why, because there's more than just yield reduction. How many of you grow soybean, or at least have been on soybean fields? Or beans, even snap beans, okay? And you get them stained with something like nightshades, black nightshade. Bad news, man. It's going to be docked. They're not, a lot of the organic growers that I work with, they will never take that when you bring it down to sell it. First of all, there's concerns that it might be poisonous, the staining, the nightshade, but also just the appearance. So you will be docked. If they even take the product, you'll be docked. Okay? For many organic growers, if you get contamination with some particularly problematic species, but even our conventional growers, they're not going to take them. They're not going to buy the products. Okay? They'll ship them. And I've seen trucks go back and have to dump the material. It's not fun. Okay? And we'll talk about that. But to a weed scientist, okay, vegetation that interferes with the objectives of people. Okay, whatever the objective. And the reason is that I could be a sports fisherman. And I've got Japanese knotweed that's blocking my entry into getting to my favorite fish hole. Okay? That's a problem. Irrigation canals. So it's not all yield. It has to do with many different, okay? There's the ecologist. For those of you who are kind of more into ecology, weeds have an important role. Okay? They thrive in habitats that have been disturbed. Okay? And they're pioneers of secondary succession. We talked about that. Okay? So they're going to be basically trying to colonize pieces of land that have been disturbed, and they're important. If you wouldn't have these, what we call these weeds, okay, you would have bare ground, you'd have soil erosion issues, okay, basically wash half of your soil off. So the fact that these plants can occupy these habitats is pretty cool. So here's the question for you, and I don't know if I mentioned it last class. But you know, these weeds that are adapted to disturbed habitats, these all came in with agriculture generally. I mean, in agriculture we really saw them. The question I have for you is, and we have a number of these weeds, remember, that are native. Ragweed, common ragweed, Ambrosia artemisifolia, is native to North America. In fact, they think it's actually native to this area, upstate New York, Quebec, Ontario, and Canada. That's where the kind of epicenter of it was. So it's not all, you know, plants that were brought from Europe, although the vast majority did come with the settlers from Europe, either purposely or they were accidentally introduced. But the question I have for you is, if we have these plants that are adapted, okay, to disturbed habitats, okay, before agriculture, before settlers came in, where were these plants? How did they hang around if they needed disturbed habitats? I mean, if nobody was tilling the land or destroying it or tilling it. Natural disasters, okay, that's a good one. So that could have happened. What else? What could be another way that these plants still had their little habitat or their little niche? So sorry? I didn't get it. Glaciers, okay. But I would say even more, kind of a more common. Sorry? What kind of animals? What was here in the Great Plains? Bison, buffalo, right. And so if you look historically, that's where they used to hang around, where the pathways of the bison, buffalo, you know, the larger animals. They'd have their normal, you know, migratory paths, and often you would see, and there's now data to show that this is the case, that you would have the ragweed and some of these plants that we call weeds that come in as soon as we cultivate our land. That's why we've got to, you know, as soon as we cultivate, we've got to put down our herbicide, or we've got to cultivate. As we carry out our tillage operation, I should say, moldboard plow or chisel plow. What happens if you leave that land bare? Or you don't do anything? Well, you can have all these weeds come up. Well, but they can only survive if you have frequent disturbance. So what we're doing in agriculture is basically always trying to push succession back to the initial stage. And nature is trying to kind of protect the land and go on, start with annuals, then the perennials, and you'll see that. So what happens to one of our ag fields that you're familiar with if we abandon it, say, for 7-8 years? If I would go there, put a quadrat down, what kind of plants would I find? Something that's been, you know, we tilled it up, we had corn, and now, you know, the farmer goes, you know, retires and the land goes back, reverts back to succession. After 6-7 years, you're going to get the goldenrods, the New England asters that you're starting to see flower all around. So often we can tell how old the field has been around by looking at the kind of species that are there. But it went through the first few years. You had the ragweed, lamb's quarters, all of our annuals, and you'll see that in the field. Okay, then the grasses, and then you start getting saplings coming in, the poplars, the birch, those plants that require sunlight. Okay, so that's all related to succession. So ecologically speaking, that's what I'm saying. It's subjective. They by no means are harmful. These plants are extremely important, but you have to come at it from that angle. If you're a corn grower or you're growing corn, beans, or vegetables, you know, succession is not what you're looking for, unless it's succession of your crops. That's not what's going to be there. Okay? And so my compromise definition: a generally unwanted plant that thrives in disturbed habitats. Those are weeds. That's what we typically call weeds. Okay? Okay? Now, weeds are not just herbaceous plants. Okay? They can be a variety of things. Okay? They can be aquatic. Can you name an aquatic weed? Milfoil. Anybody has to be. You just go to some of our lakes. I mean, that's just. Can you name a tree species that's considered weedy? A tree. Sorry? Sumac? Tree of heaven is probably one. Elianthus altissimum. Altissimum means high, you know, going towards the heavens. It's all over around here. It looks like sumac. And I'll show you the difference at the weed garden, how you tell the two apart. It's got this kind of peanutty taste. And now, again, give you some practical tips on how to tell them apart. We can have duckweed. We can have cyanobacteria. And if some of you have heard, there's been die-offs going on. You know, red bloom, algal blooms. They can be weedy. Okay? So it's not just, you know, the lamb squirters, the velvet leaf, these plants that you often see in ag. It's wide variety. Some of you are down from Florida, Melaleuca. Big problem. Tremendous problem. If you're from Australia, there was prickly pear was a big issue way back. Okay? So I just want to, you know, make sure that you're aware that, you know, weeds is broader than just what we typically see. Okay? And typically the most troublesome weed species are those that are short-lived, particularly for ag. Okay? Because what do? Why is that? You know, you would think, what? Shouldn't it be the long-lived guys that are the problem? Why the short-lived? What do they do that's kind of neat?
They reproduce and produce seeds over and over and over.
Over and over again, and lots of them. And we'll go over the strategies of plants. Why it's a battle for anybody who's trying to control weeds. Why it's a constant battle. It's because these things reproduce so fast. How many of you have done this? I mean, you start your vegetable garden. We're all gung-ho. You know, I put it on, I put my tomatoes in, my eggplants, and then for some reason I kind of, let nature take care of itself. I'm gone for a month or two, come back. Do you think I see my tomatoes nicely sitting there? No, I've got crabgrass, I've got everything but, because those weeds have been selected. They're selected, selective pressure. We didn't select them just from our practices. We selected very competitive, fast-growing species. Again, something like lamb squirters can produce 250,000 seeds, one plant. Striga, which I'll show you later in this presentation, major parasitic weed, 500,000 to 750,000 microscopic seeds. You can't even see them, okay, that are produced. So that's really, really worrisome. The two families where most of our weeds, what we would call weedy problematic species, the grasses, the Poaceae, okay, and the Asteraceae, the composites, okay? Not surprising, that's where a lot of our crops come from. They're in the same families. Okay? The grasses, the monocots, you name them. Corn, millet, sorghum, you know, sugarcane, just you name the species. But that's where most of our weeds are as well. And I'll give you some numbers. Okay? Okay, when is a weed a weed? Very, very important. I touched upon this in the last class. Remember I told you what happens if I'm growing I've been growing Roundup Ready corn, and now I'm into soybean, okay? And I've got my soybean plant, and I look in my field, and I've got this corn popping left and right. I haven't controlled it, okay? You'd say, corn? That's not a weed. I'll say, in that situation, it's a plant growing out of place. The corn in there is a weed. It's a volunteer crop. It's a weedy species, okay? So don't assume that automatically, because you think dandelion, oh, it's a weed and turf, it's a problem, that everybody sees it that way. And if you go, you know, you have folks that think it's the most beautiful thing to have those beautiful yellow flowers, okay? You might have, like I said, I'll give you an example, this example, just to prove how problematic this can be. I have folks, when I tell them I'm trying to control common milkweed for one of the corn growers, they're up in arms. No, it's the natural food source for the monarch butterflies. It's native. You shouldn't be going in there. You can't argue that they're wrong. You might say, well, in this situation, the milkweed is, you know, reducing yields of my corn. So yeah, it's a problem. Okay, this thing, Echium. We have a similar species. I don't know how many of you might know this plant. It grows on gravelly soils. Some of you might have seen it. In North America, it's called blueweed. So it's a really nice plant, purple, red, beautiful flowers. You'll see it along railroads at about this time of year. The bees love it. Bees love this plant. It's kind of spiny. But there was a similar species, same genus, in Australia, okay, that the beekeepers loved. Okay, they just love this plant because it's great for you know, nectar and so forth. So the problem was that it was also a major weed in pastures. And if you know anything about Australia, have been there, and New Zealand was the same thing. They're big on pastures, a lot of sheep and so forth and cattle. And so the ranchers wanted to get rid of it, okay? And so what they did is they started they got together with some folks, some biological control aid. They weren't going to use herbicides. They were going to use, and Australia was pretty ahead of the game in terms of pesticide use, and a lot of them they can't even use them because there's resistance now. But what they did is they spent over $1.5 million to find the right insect that was going to eat and consume this plant selectively, okay, in the pastures. They were just about to release it. Just about to release it. And I remember this. I was in grad school. And my major professor was one of the, he was a consultant. And the Beekeeper Association, as they had public hearings, they didn't know about it till it kind of made, we're going to have public hearing controlling this. They lobbied so hard, they stopped that project right there, okay? They got the, legislators involved, and they said, no, this plant is too valuable from, it is, what are you calling it, a weed? It is not a weed, okay? And the two of them really went hard at it. But just to prove it, here's $1.5 million, $2 million. This would have been in the 80s. That's a lot of money, okay? Project was stopped. The insect worked. It was going to work. They had done all the good, the typical work that needed to be done. But again, what is a weed? So what I'm telling you, this is the take-home message for all of you once you leave Cornell or you're here still and you're doing projects. Whenever you're in a situation where you need to control vegetation, make sure that you're aware of who might be in favor of this. Who am I working on? You're working for a grower. Of course, they're going to tell you likely that, yes, this is the weed you need to control. But be aware of who else is around. If you've got, naturalist clubs and so forth, be aware of what their concerns may be. You must still decide, hey, in this situation, this is a weed, I'm going to control it. But don't neglect that others might not see it in the same way. And this often happens for invasive species, too. For those of you who work in natural areas, very, very important to be aware of what others are thinking. Not just because Tony said it's a weed, everybody thinks it's a weed, okay? And again, we'll see some plants today in the weed garden that I bet you some of you are going to say, what? What's wrong with this plant? Look at the beauty of this thing. And others, yeah, anybody who knows how to, when it grows in with your vegetable crops, how a problem it can be. So that to me is referred to as conflict of interest, okay? So anytime, that should be the first thing you think about. Who are the players? Okay, it's not that you're going to try to play defense, but just be open-minded about it. Okay? Like I said, I've argued with my dad about dandelions on turf. He's got to get rid of them. There's no way, and I keep saying, leave them in there. White clover, I like white clover. It's in there. It's a nitrogen fixer. I don't have to fertilize the lawn. But for some people, aesthetically, that's not the case. If you're in, turf industry or you're working on, golf courses, it's very important that you have that consistency in turf. You can't have weeds popping out and affecting, the ball and just the trajectory. And we could argue about that, but that's something we can talk about. Okay, so if I were to ask you, name some characteristics of weeds that make them really a problem, what would they be? Attributes. What is it about weeds that's different from a crop, say, generally? That you say, no, this is a weed, it's a weed.
Aggressive growing and nutrient scavenging.
Okay, aggressive growth. They scavenge nutrients, okay? Basically go get whatever they can, absolutely.
They reproduce like
Okay,
crazy.
high reproductive output, put most of their energy, and we'll see. How many of you, just in passing, from ecology or some biology courses you've taken, I've heard of the term R&K selection. R&K selection. Don't be afraid if you don't. Never heard of it, that's cool. We'll talk about that. It's basically one way you can categorize animals, plants, in terms of how much energy do they invest in reproduction. Okay? Weeds are R-selected because they put a lot of their energy in reproduction. Yes, Steve?
They mature out of sync with the crop, or maybe even out of sync with themselves.
Okay. So their timing, they can basically, adjust the timing of flowering and setting seed and so forth. Okay? Any other? That's one of the main issues for growers and for anybody. And I may or may not have told you this, but if you want to become famous, if any of you really want fame, okay, you want to be, in the news, kind of put Barack and McCain aside and Gustav and you'll be front page, is if you can find a way to get all weed seeds in the ground to germinate at once, so that you could clean them out or do whatever you want, or not allow any wheat seeds in the ground to germinate. You will win the Nobel Prize, I guarantee you. Nobody to this date has found the trick. They've tried chemicals, they've tried cultivating in the middle of the night and so forth. Nobody's done that because of this issue. that weed seeds have long, weird dormancy, and we'll talk about that. How many growers want to put in, they're just putting in 30,000, corn plants per acre, and take a gamble that maybe only half of them are going to emerge or germinate? You think most growers are going to do that? What's the germinability of most of our crop seeds? 99%, 95, 100%. If they don't come up, it's because maybe it's a wet spot or something. Nobody's going to want 20% like we get in velvet leaf, okay, or lamb scores. Those seeds that are falling in the ground, not all of them are going to germinate. And they all have different dormancies and require different environmental conditions to germinate. That's why it's such a problem, okay? And some of them can survive. We have seeds that have survived 100 years in soil. Not all. But velvet leaf, maybe 0.5% of 50,000 seeds, that's still a fair number. So no matter what you do for 7, 8 years, 10 years, you could be the best. You're still going to get stuff coming up. Okay? That's a big, big number one. And that's part of my research here at Cornell, is looking at seed dormancy and seed bank dynamics, because we got to understand what's going on below ground. Okay? So anybody else have any other ideas as to why weeds could be a problem? Yeah, they're not wimpish like a lot of our crops. Come on, guys, we've got to baby them in some ways, because they don't care. Anybody try to grow, what happens when you grow, I learned the hard way. I tried to grow tomatoes I had tomatoes, and then I was trying to be cool, thinking of birds, bring the birds in. I had sunflowers. These Russian sunflowers that are like, you ever see those things? They tip over. The Blue Jays loved it. Do you know what happened to my tomatoes? And not because they didn't get sunlight. Does anybody know what sunflower does? It's a bit like your walnuts. Releases a little chemicals. Wiped out my tomatoes. I didn't know that. In a circle. You could see the range. That's called the allelopathy for some of you if you're interested. We'll talk about that. Release of chemicals to inhibit the growth of other plants. Okay? And so there's a lot of work. So that's competition. Okay? And I saw this circle, and I said, what happened to my tomatoes? Then I started reading on sunflowers. Oh, it's known to be allelopathic. A lot of weeds are. A lot of weeds. So walnut, a lot of you know juglone is the chemical that's actually released. Okay? Sorghum. A lot of great work done in the Department of Horticulture here at Cornell by Leslie Weston. They actually identified sorgoleone is the active ingredient that inhibits. They noticed it was, particularly varieties were inhibiting the growth of other plants and weeds. So natural herbicides in a sense. Okay? A lot of this this is what we were going after for most of you. We were talking about rapid growth rate, abundant reproduction, effective dispersal. Look at milkweed or swallowwort or some, or horsetail. Gone. I mean, little, they have little parachutes and here they go forever. Okay? Persistent propagules. Very important. Plasticity, generalists. They adapt. So here we have velvet leaf. You'll see it today. Velvet leaf, 12 feet high. And as I mentioned, in soybean, it'll be just above the canopy, 4 or 5 feet. It's not going to go to 12. It doesn't have to. So they're very plastic. So plasticity is how the plant looks and how it reacts to a changing environment. Most of our crops don't have that. It's been bred out of them. We want them for high yield, taste. Okay? And so generally they get wiped out by our weeds. And so we need to work closely with the plant breeders to try to bring some of that back. The undesirable characteristics, most of you guys know. Reduce yields, interfere with crop, poisonous to humans and livestock. How many of you guys know a plant called Jimson weed? Datura stramonium. Okay, what is it known for? Although it's not a nice way to be known. Apart from it being a weed, it's a solanaceous species in the potato-tomato family. What part of the plant? The seeds and seed pods, okay? And every year in this country, and then when I was in Canada, every year 2, 3 teenagers would die, thinking this is cool, you smoke the stuff, and they kill you, okay? So, allergenic, this is obviously more than allergenic, but this whole idea that these plants, just because it's natural, this is the other thing, this is natural, it's going to be good for you. No, we have some of our most potent, poisons, chemicals that are produced naturally by plants. You just have to be aware of them, okay? But if any of you are suffering from hay fever right now, it's peak season for ragweed. It's bad for, everybody's popping claritins and since it's been dry. This is exactly what these plants love. And livestock. How many of you are dairy? Or at least have some dairy background. What happens if your cattle would munch on something called stinkweed or wild garlic? Smells like your milk is done. Stinkweed, you'll see it. It's called falspeat, okay? Also called pennycress. You rub it, it smells. Animals eat that, it smells bad. There's another plant called St. John's wort. How many of you have heard of this plant? Again, these names will all mean something. You will see these plants. The way you can tell this plant that has yellow flowers is you take the leaves, you look at it in the light, and it's going to have all these little holes, like you think they're shot holes. They're glands, okay? And it's a European species. It has an active ingredient called hypericin, okay? And it's by homeopaths, it's actually considered a mood enhancer. So it fights depression. So and I have an article in the back of your handout there where I took it out of one of the newspapers. It was outselling Prozac in Germany 4-1. Okay, so they use this plant, the active ingredient. I think I'm trying to remember if it's from the flower or the leaves. I don't recall. And there were some folks here at Cornell working on it. It's actually in the root. Okay, you're probably right. And I've always known it as a weed. So, when I got, what? And I had students come in with their little caplets. I said, oh, man, this has been good. And I got a bit worried. I mean, I'm sure it does have mood-enhancing abilities. But what it also has, and why I'm relating this to livestock, is that in fair-skinned animals, when they browse or eat the St. John's wort, which occurs in pastures, those animals become very sensitive to light. They get what is referred to as photodermatitis. Okay? They start getting these red blotches on their skin, and I've seen it here. I mean, I've been out with some of the girls and say, oh, what have they been eating? And, oh, man, there's a patch of St. John's wort there. I said, no, these animals are going to... And their milk production drops like 50%. And if you don't get them out of there, it could really cause serious... Half the time, they're just kind of scratching, trying to get out of there. Okay? And so, especially for light-skinned animals. And this is the same. And so my thought was, why wouldn't this be the same for humans? You're taking these pills, you're going out suntanning, and it's serious. And this is not overseen by the FDA. This is just, it's out there. It's a natural product, but you have to be really careful. Okay? But for livestock, that's a big problem. Okay? That's a concern. And of course, I don't have to tell you about physical attributes. Spines. No, I have not seen cows go get that bull thistle. Man, they work around it. And I actually had a student, they did a master's degree on looking at the insects and a microbial community around bull thistle and Canada thistle patches in a pasture, in a dairy pasture. Because the diversity is amazing. You don't find it anywhere else except there. And the whole reason is that the animals won't touch that plant, which is not a bad thing. I mean, they're smart. Okay? I'm not going to go through all what makes an ideal weed. One of the questions I used to ask in one of the prelims is if I sent you off to Mars and you wanted to, there was civilization there and you said, I have to put the civilization away. I'm going to create the worst weed that I can for them so that they won't have any crops. What would you do it? How would you engineer it? What would be the attributes or the characteristics based on what you've learned in this class that, you would want to create? And so this list that you also have there is the who's who, the best kind of things. Broad germination requirement, we talked a bit about that. Seed dormancy, okay? I.e. the seeds won't germinate all at once, okay? And that's a problem because you want them to germinate or not germinate, but not 10% at a time. 10% this year, 5% next year, 10%. No, that's not what you want, okay? Rapid development. That's always amazes me, how fast these things, man, you're gone for a week, the next thing you know, you get there and these things are already seeding. It's unbelievable, okay? So things like continuous reproduction, okay? Even in bad conditions, most of our crops will stop, if it's droughty and stuff. These things don't really care. They've been selected. They keep going. You've seen your lawns. If you don't water them, the lawns go dormant. What do you see in there if you've got some weeds? You see your dandelion nice and green, okay? You see your plantain nice and green. You see your smart weeds, nice and green. These things are just adapted. High seed output, okay? even under unfavorable conditions, and I'm just giving you examples. Self-compatible, that's important. They don't need to have another, they need to be cross-pollinated. Simple things like wind and generalist pollinators can do it. Okay, grasses don't need. You don't have to have this specific bumblebee that needs to be in the Amazon to go get the specific endangered species. If it goes, the plant's gone. The weeds are not going to disappear because wind is going to be around as far as we know. Okay, so that's important. And if they need to be cross-pollinated, it's done by unspecialized. You don't need this one, insect that's very specific to you. Doesn't matter as long as you get. So these are all traits that make these things a real pain. Okay, and this is just to show you what I'm trying to show you here is how things germinate, even during the growing season. A lot of you have probably noticed, you go into spring, there's a peak of weeds germinating and stuff, then it may cool down, then you get another flush. It depends on the species, okay? If you think of this as being, this is February, March, April, this is spring. Now, this is for the UK, so you're going, February, we don't have many things germinating in February around here, that's true. But just to give you an idea, and these are the different weed species through the year, and they're just showing you the length of this, or the size of this tells you, basically the amplitude tells you how much germination of that particular species you get at that time of year in a given agronomic field. And the length of it, you notice that some of them, like shepherd's purse, pretty well throughout the growing season, almost the whole year. These things are coming up continuously. They peak in the spring and maybe in the fall, okay? And then others are a little more discreet. They're either very early in the spring, so black bindweed or what we call wild buckwheat, okay? That's wild buckwheat is very much in the springtime, okay? So that's why it's so hard, and you need to know what the weeds are. Because you can't say, well, they're all going to germinate throughout the season. There's some that are not. You've got to target them early. And that's the same for invasive species, okay? So knowing the biology, know your enemy before you can carry out management. That's why we're going to spend half of this class talking about biology and ecology and weed ID, and then we talk about control. Because if you have no idea, I'm going to just spray, without having an idea, you spray, and then these guys are back in the fall. That doesn't make any sense, okay? So this is to show you that the germination, okay, distribution varies by the species you're talking about, okay? How many of you knew this, even before I showed you this, that there are some species that are going to be there throughout the growing season. Others, you see them really early, and then they're gone. Others, you see late. We're starting to have things germinate right now. What do we call those plants? Things germinating. They're from seed right now. This is September. Winter annuals. Okay, they're annuals, but they do the total opposite of most of our weeds that germinate in the spring. They grow during the summer and now are setting seed. The foxtails, the lamb's quarters, the pigweeds. We have plants like stinkweed, chickweeds that are just germinating now. They're coming. How are they going to spend the winter? Are they going to die? Under the snow. They're going to sit as seedlings or little rosettes under there. As soon as the snow melts in the spring, boom, before you even get into the field, these things are already going. Full speed, almost like our winter ride. Okay? We call them winter annuals. They just survive 1 year or one growing season, but the growing season is the weird one. It's from fall, winter, spring. They're dead by June, i.e. they've let their seeds go through the summer and start up in the spring again. In the fall. Okay? Winter annual versus spring, summer annuals. Okay? These are still some adaptations that I wanted to tell you about. Long, short distance dispersal, What's the dispersal like for something like burdock? Remember burdock? Those spines, the Velcro invention was based on that. What's that kind of dispersal like? Animal. How many of you guys have your dogs or cats or animals and stuff gets in? And if you're into sheep, that's trouble. Because that gets into the wool, you can't get it out. You've got to basically shear the animal down. And I've got a good friend that has llamas here, and when they go in burdock patches, he's done. He's got to you can't pull them out, okay? So that's kind of short and long-term, These animals will go in areas that you think, how did they get here? That happens, okay? Another important characteristics of weeds is that they reproduce both sexually and asexually, vegetatively, by underground rhizome, quackgrass, Canada thistle. Remember I told you Canada thistle can go 15 feet down? and then it pops up left and right, and we'll talk about that strategy. It's called the guerrilla strategy. Guerrilla versus, let me give you some terminology just for fun. Let's see how many of you guys know some history here. Okay. These are strategies. I don't know how well you could see it. Okay. I should. PHALANX, phalanx strategy. Any of you guys military? If you got military backgrounds or you're interested, this is cool. Guerrilla. I think most of you know what guerrilla. How does this relate, do you think, to plants that reproduce vegetatively? And what I mean by vegetatively, remember they grow, a bit like your strawberry plants, they have little daughter plantlets, these stems called stolons above ground. Below ground, the stems are referred to as rhizomes. Quackgrass, Canada thistle, bindweeds. Okay? What's this strategy like? If I say something like quackgrass has a guerrilla-type strategy for advancing or spreading, what would that be? What is it how is it expanding? Below ground, but how? Remember, it's trying to occupy space. It's trying to wipe you out, wipe your favorite crop, whatever. Pops behind the lines, so if you could think, I'm the army here, the army would be the native vegetation. If you're, in invasive species, this is very important as well. But even for crops, you've got your corn or you've got your favorite native species you're trying to keep there. You've got this front of, quackgrass that's going to move in a guerrilla. What it's going to do, it's going to put, and a good species that does this a lot too is Japanese knotweed or wild bamboo, Polygonum cuspidatum. Beautiful flowering right now. If you look at these white flowers, it's all over the 366, the 81. But anyway, it'll put out these rhizomes, go behind the enemy lines, i.e. behind it, and start popping here and there, kind of guerrilla. And from there then expands. Over time, if you don't do anything, they fuse. And they become a major front. Okay? So that's one strategy. What do you think the phalanx strategy of occupation is? If you remember Roman history or Greek history, what did these guys do? Or even Civil War, what do? They'd stand in line and just march. And guys would be getting shot and that, but they're still moving. They move as a front. Okay? And in invasive plant ecology or some of you are going to work in invasive natural areas, one of the questions that you're going to have is, because you're not going to have the resources. If the world was perfect, you'd have resources to control both of these strategies. Plants that would be doing this, and some plants do both. The question I have for you, if you have limited resources, and let's say you're the plantations manager, invasive species, you're Todd Bittner. You've got to decide, I've got swallowwort or garlic mustard that's in guerrilla here and there. It's popping left and right, and then I've got a patch near BB Lake that's just huge, and clearly it's moving. Limited resources. I can't have all of you guys there helping me out. Where would I put my energies? Where should I put my energies? And again, some of you may not know. By the end of the course, hopefully you'll know. But let me just give it to you up front. What do you think the best strategy would be? Should I put my energy in controlling this big front that's just moving? I mean, it's going to move. But, it's taken over land. Or should I worry about these spots here, kind of little hot spots, but they're relatively small? Doesn't look like they're going to be an issue. Which one would you go after? And why? Exactly. We always tell our managers that if you're limited resources, go after these guys. Put out those fires. First of all, it's manageable. Yeah, you might have a lot, but it's manageable. You can dig them out. You can, put some Roundup, whatever technique you want to use. This is going to be there. You're not going to wipe, even if you put down a herbicide, it's not going to wipe it in the first shot. What I would do is, for example, if it's something like swallowwort, which produces pods and seeds, or a big way it reproduces, is at least mow it. Try to mow it down, chop, make sure it doesn't go to seed, but you're not going to get rid of it. You've put your time in here, these guys go unabated, you're going to get major issues. The analogy would be, and I know all of you are going to do this, you're going to put all your energies in this course, because you know this course is like the top course you need to know. And you're going to forget about your other courses, which I hope you won't do. But what happens after about 2 months of doing that? You might still not be doing well in this course, but the rest of the courses are going down the drain. They're getting out of hand. You're just not going to be able to make it up. Okay? What I'm saying is spread the good news around a little bit. You know, work your other courses here. It's going to, you know, you're going to have to learn all these weeds, but you're still going to put some energy in it. But don't let any of them go down the drain. But I would argue, and it's been shown, that putting that energy in those small, isolated, what we call nascent, N-A-S-C-E-N-T, I'll give you that information later, but foci, very, very important from a practical perspective. The economics have shown this. So if some of you are in those, and this goes for our ag folks. You've got velvet leaf, a patch in part of your field, you know, and in another part you've got calathis, so yeah, you might want to, you know, cut that down and keep working on it, but go after that velvet leaf or that weed that looks like it's not a big deal, but might become a big deal, okay? So very, very, very important aspect, okay? And we talked about allelopathy, the release, okay, of chemicals to inhibit the growth or germination of other species. And when it's your crop, it's not fun. Like I said, with the sunflowers going after my tomatoes, no tomatoes that year, in a nice circle, okay? This is becoming a major, major issue. 95% of our corn and soybean receive herbicides, okay? 95%. So this is still important, and we're starting to get major herbicide resistance. What's herbicide resistance?
The herbicide wipes out all of them except for those that have a genetic variation that lets them not be killed.
Okay.
It's only those that spread their seeds, so the next generation.
Right. So here's a question. If some of you guys are going to become certified crop consultants or doesn't matter. Does the fact that you use herbicides cause them to become resistant, these weeds? So let's say I've got velvet leaf, and all of a sudden I find out, man, I put atrazine, one of the important corn herbicides, on it. It used to kill it, you know, or at least knock it back. No, nothing's happening to it. Could somebody come to me and say, you see, Tony, you've caused it. By using the herbicide, you have caused resistance. How do I argue? Is this true or not? Or is there some truth to what they're saying, or is it completely false? Emily?
You don't cause the plants to become resistant. The resistance is already there naturally. You just apply the selective pressure to increase the amount of plants that are resistant in the population.
Exactly. Exactly. So let me just make sure you guys all get this. Is that in a million plants, there is, for whatever reason, maybe a spurious mutation, something happened in the DNA of one of the lamb squatters that for whatever reason has made it tolerant or resistant to the herbicide. 99.99% of the other plants around it will get killed. So what I'm saying is that the mere fact that I used the herbicide didn't cause the mutation. The mutation occurred naturally. You know, it happens. You get DNA, and, you know, sometimes in replication you get errors. What I'm saying is, and I think what Emily was saying that's important, is by, you know, constantly putting the selective pressure, using the same herbicide, you know, over and over again, you're basically killing off all the susceptibles, and that one that had that spurious mutation now is able to reproduce. And first it's 0.1% of the population, then it's 2%, 3%, 5%. Do you know when most growers notice that they have a resistance problem in their fields? What percent of the field, what percent of the population of a given weed, let's say it's lamb squatters, atrazine resistant, which is a big one. At what point in a field, on percentage of the population, do 100% of the plants have to be resistant for the growers to see it? No. Do you know what percentage? Just 10? 30% on average. Some growers are better. It takes about 30% is a lot of weeds. And the grower has not picked up yet that there's a problem there. What do often growers, or even land managers, what are they likely to say if they don't get control? Yeah, you know, something, I didn't put enough. Oh, this was the wet spot. Oh, my nozzle didn't work here. You know, I mean, not all of them, but, you know, the first time it happens, that's what happens. That's why we tell growers, keep an eye out, and they usually know. Number of you are growers. Growers, just in case you don't know, are very proud folks. Very proud. They hate to admit that they're wrong, okay? Especially from somebody like me coming there and telling them that, oh, I think you've got a problem. But deep inside, a lot of them will know after a while, say, yeah, there's something there. That field, it's always been the case. that's when we'll do a bioassay. We'll take the plants and do some quick testing. And you have kits now that you could test right in the field. Okay? So that's very, very important. And this is becoming an issue. And it is becoming a major issue now that we're using Roundup for everything. Because what happens? We're using Roundup-ready corn, Roundup-ready soybeans. We have Roundup-ready alfalfa. I don't even know if has it been registered yet in New York? They're keeping it back. Monsanto had Roundup-ready wheat, ready to go, but due to public pressure, took it off the shelf out west with the worry that they would get, basically the resistance gene moving to wild relatives. And we have a lot of grasses. We don't have as many soybean-related species, weed species. So it's a concern, this whole thing of a super weed, and we'll have a lecture on that. But this is big. A lot of you are going to be dealing with this, okay? If we don't watch what we're doing, these are plants, they're biological beings, they evolve. As soon as we try something, they're going to back us with something else. The gene for gene kind of, in plant pathology theory. You do something, they're going to bounce back. So doing the same thing over and over again, if you think that biotech this is my personal opinion, is the silver bullet, just like when herbicides came out in the 40s. You read some of the early articles, when herbicides first came in the late 40s and the 50s, you would think there'd be no weeds left. Wow, we found it. Silver bullet. It's here. It's over. No weeds? No. We're still there. Same with biotech. It's a great tool, but if misused, we're going to be, and this is what's happening. I am not seeing smart use of this product by some of our industry. Okay? Looking at short-term economic gains rather than thinking of our growers long-term. And you can't blame the grower for deciding to use this when it is $10, $20 cheaper per acre. Because they're looking at short-term, they have to survive. But somebody has to stand up and say, this isn't right for long-term sustainability. This is my little spiel. And I'll give you more information as to why that's going to be the case, and it's going to hit our growers the most. Okay? So, just showing you a plant that you will see, Johnson grass, predicted by 2050 to be the #1 weed in New York State. It is now the #1 weed down south, Tennessee, the Carolinas. They told us here, we have it in the weeds garden, and we'll see it this afternoon. They told us that this plant, it's a perennial, has these big rhizomes, okay, grows 10 feet tall. Wouldn't survive in New York, in Ithaca. Too cold, can't make it. 7 straight years. Come back every year. It was down in the plantations. The plant, plantations people are after us. We got to get rid of it. It's not going to happen. As winter temperatures, we don't get as cold, you're going to have this. So I put it up just to give you, and you'll see Johnson grass. For those, a very, very impressive plant. There's the rhizomes, those underground stems. Some of these things are thick, like you wouldn't believe it, and you'll be looking at that. Quackgrass, okay, is another of our species. Elytricia repens. How many of you guys see that in the spring? Oh, man, I've got to go in and till. And you know what happens, right? The more you cultivate and you cut up those little segments, those rhizomes, what happens? If you only do it once, if you cultivate just once with quackgrass, do you think you're going to help your situation or worsen it? Worse. These things can reproduce even if they're like half an inch. So if you cut them in little pieces, you're helping dispersal. And I have seen fields covered with it. And yellow nutsedge is another one, for those of you who are familiar with this plant. Okay? I like this because students like to know, hey, top 10, David Letterman. Top 10 weed families, top 10 weeds in the world, in a broadly speaking. And this was Weed Scientist in 1977. I think they have a new book out in 97. It's pretty close, so I just wanted to leave that. These are the top, what are considered the top 10 weeds agronomically in the world. Some of them, I should say, sadly, are here in the States and in particularly New York State. And those are these that you're going to see today. Okay? Some of them you know, barnyard grass. Major. How many of you have worked in rice systems? #1 weed. Some of you are from overseas. Okay? It looks so much like, when they're transplanting and when they're weeding, they pull out the rice by mistake. Looks exactly the same. I've worked with carrot farmers. How many of you guys grow carrots here? If you've got some ragweed in the carrots, very difficult to separate them. Okay, and I'll show you a video of some growers in Canada that I worked with. They did something kind of illegal. They actually sprayed a herbicide that was illegal for use in carrots. The only reason they did it is that it turns the ragweed a brown color so that they could go in and hand weed the right crop. Leave the carrots, don't disturb Okay, because you would see, oh man, you would see a carrot because they're very much the same. The leaves are dissected and you'll see them. We'll show you wild carrot. I mean, if it's wild carrot and carrot, forget it. Apart from the white taproot, you can't tell them apart. They smell like carrots. They're the same species. It's just a variety, a cultivar. Okay, but here they are: goosegrass, Johnson grass. I told you about. These are big ones. Portulaca is common purslane, the one that I tell you a lot of people like to have it in salads. It's got this nice little lemony taste to it. Okay? It's the only species that's got what we call a CAM physiology, C-A-M. Do you guys remember C3, C4, CAM? C3, photosynthesis, C4, CAM? What's CAM? Just go back to that basic biology. Don't worry if you don't remember. There's no panic. Does anybody remember what the hell were they talking about? CAM.
It's especially adapted to desert-type heat water conditions.
Do you know what it stands for? Today's presentation, a couple of housekeeping duties. Reminder that for the Tuesday group, we have lab this afternoon, okay, 1:30, okay, and so very, very efficient at water. This thing, when it's in your corn or your vegetable crops, which often it is, #1 weed in lettuce. So anybody's had lettuce and anybody's worked at Dillman Hill will know, okay. It's not a competitor for light because it grows prostrate right along the ground. But what does it do, man? Does it suck up that water? If you've got drought, it is just going to wipe you out. And in corn, it does the same thing. Most growers, oh, it's not a big deal. And you got this patch of this thing that's this big. And during drought, it is drawing. It can survive. Your corn is looking like pineapples or onions. So knowing what these plants compete for is going to be very important. Just wanted to tell you the 3 or 4 families that have our major weeds. What families? The grasses, the composites, and the sedges. Okay? So the 3 of them make up almost 50%, 43% of all the weeds in North America, or even in the world here actually, are in those 3 families. But those are also the 3 most key families for our crops. Remember, these things all evolve. There's a relationship between them. Okay? And again, I would not ask you, can you please, rattle off what % of the crops are, for any exam. This is more globally. Understand the big picture before we get into kind of some of the details. Okay. We've spoken a bit about this. The weeds not only compete for light nutrients, but they also increase the costs of production. As was mentioned, if you've got to spend half the time come off your combine to tease apart all the weeds that are stuck in, that's time. That's valuable time for a grower, for anybody. Okay? If they delay ripening or they spoil your silage or your grain, that's a big problem. It happens. You have to control these plants. Okay? Lower quality. How many of you have heard the word dockage? I mean, particularly you hear that. Matt, how do you have come across that word? Where does it come in? Okay, so you're going to lose money. The quality has been reduced. Okay, if I'm going and buy turf seed and half of the seeds in there are going to be, they're not grade A or quality. There are going to be always some weed seeds in there, but you pay based on also the quality that you have in there, the contamination. There's some regulations on how much you can actually have. Okay.
A lot of times, weeds will carry common diseases, so it increases, in beets, it will increase the disease. So you got docked because so many more diseases.
Right. Right, and in organic systems, I'm trying to think of when vetch seeds get into, your cereals and so forth. I think that's mainly it is really serious. They will not purchase any of that because they're so difficult to control. Remember, organic growers don't have access to herbicides, and in some cases you can't just say, so very, very, very serious. Okay, we talked about tainted milk. For those of you in dairy, very serious. I mean, you start getting stuff smelling garlicky, you're done. It's going to take a while to get it out of the system of the animal. It doesn't do much to the animal. The animal's okay, but nobody's going to purchase. Okay? Burrs and sheep wool, and anybody from Australia and New Zealand knows that. Deformed root crops, I see it in carrots with ragweed. They just look very, they're all it's almost like, nematode got in there, but it has to do with competition. The plant there's no way these would be grade A type marketable. Just going to have to go to, the cull pile. Lower palatability of forage. You got weeds in there. It's just, some are really nutritious, but a lot of them are not. And the growers are not going to, if you've got pastures, don't worry about this. I was just trying to show you that for a lot of growers, I would say that's disaster, 35% yield loss. Okay, weed-free, no losses. Most growers, if they go below 5% yield loss, that's unacceptable. And when we'll do economic thresholds, most growers you'll see it's a 5-10% cutoff. We'll do a weed, when do growers recognize that this is not going to cut it? This is disaster. I mean, this is the acceptable range. Anything over there is over. And this happens often, okay? Poisonings, okay? How many of you have horses? Interested in horses? You don't want this plant called horsetails in there for young animals. Very bad. It looks almost like a fern-looking thing, just like branches. It doesn't have any leaves, okay? You'll see it. Equisetum, very problematic. Tansy ragwort in cattle is dangerous. Outright dangerous. I mean, the animal eats a fair amount of, maybe one plant won't do it, but a number of plants, really problematic. Okay? Some of these plants, just in case you're wondering, and I know some of the plantations people are here, there's a beautiful, right next to the vet college as you go down Tower Road, right off to your left as you have to decide to go to your right or left, is a beautiful poisonous weed garden, or plant garden. There's, you should go there. They're labeled. And the plantations people do a great job of keeping that. And I've often, gone there to take a look at some plants. And it's really amazing. You go, what? I didn't know red clover could be a problem. Oh, yeah, it can be. Yes, Stephen. Oh, did you have a question? Okay. So this is that St. John's wort, okay? This whole skin sensitivity in the animals that, reduces milk production. Spines, if they get into the animals, major, major issues, okay? As Megan was saying, issues with weeds, harboring insects, or diseases that can jump onto crops. And in fact, Eric, your project is dealing with that, right? I mean, can you just say a quick word about what you're, in terms of weeds being hosts? It's a range of weeds, but it's a host for?
It's, the weeds I'm studying are possibly hosts for Iris yellow spot virus, a virus of onions.
Okay.
And the virus is spread by onion thrips.
Okay, so onion thrips, so do you see this kind of tritrophic, and so you say, well, I don't care about my field edges, and that's what Eric's been sampling is field edges that the growers, say there's no weeds in the field, but if they're a host, they're going to be coming back and forth in the field. So we talk a lot about that in, diversifying our ag systems and allowing strips for beneficial insects, but let's not forget that there are also some, pretty nasty, diseases and pests that can also survive on these plants. So that is always a concern, the mustards and brassica pests. Okay, we want to use them in a positive way, but they can all. This is tansy ragwort, if some of you are familiar with. I know the picture isn't great, but it almost looks like a little sunflower plant. Okay, it is in the Asteraceae and so forth. Okay, this thing's becoming a little annoying here. Okay, aquatic environment, human health. Okay, if you're down from Florida in particular, or you're close to water bodies, they are always having trouble with drainage issues. These things clog up systems. They get in the way. They block, intake pipes and so forth, restrict irrigation. So I've often, worked with some, and they definitely depress real estate values. If you know next door to you, you've got this flush of water hyacinth, as much as this plant is beautiful, if you know what it is, this beautiful floating plant, and you go, wow, what's the problem? Well, to try to control it is a big deal. Okay? Remember, you're near water, so you can't be just using any kind of herbicide there. You have to be really careful, and there are many restrictions. Anytime you get near water bodies, and some of you know it by, in your own farms, you have to be, there's a boundary that you have to respect in terms of spraying and so forth. The human health part of it is very big. Allergies, common ragweed, I told you it's costing the U.S. economy $1 billion a year in lost wages, medication. People can't go to work, and I'll show you a video of a Discovery Channel piece that they did when I was up in Canada working on we found an insect that actually feeds only on ragweed, and they talk a bit about that and what that means for folks that are suffering from hay fever. I mean, it's major, major inconvenience. I mean, it's also can threaten you if you're kind of have respiratory issues to start with. How many of you have had poison ivy or wild parsnip? And, oh, man, this is out there. I just did a piece for one of the Syracuse stations about 3 weeks ago on wild parsnip, which is you'll see it up at the Weeds Garden today or tomorrow for those of you on the Wednesday lab. And you should all know what this plant is, because this is the plant we're seeing most people getting dermatitis, major rashes, because they don't even know that the plant caused this. It's in the carrot family. It's got yellow flowers. Right now it looks brown. If you look down, you see these beautiful goldenrods. And then in between, if you look on the 1381, these brown patches of these, these plants, they're about 5-6 feet tall. And you go, what is that? And the sap, that if it hits your skin, and if you're sensitive, which most people are, and it's in sunlight, when most of you guys are out there, weeding and, snapping, this stuff goes on, you should see what happens. It's really, really bad. And just to give you an example, the characteristics, and you could Google this. If you say wild parsnip symptoms, they'll show you this. But one case that I had heard about, and I wasn't directly involved with it, but I had known, what happens is this kind of on the side, but just to tell you how important, knowing about this from poisonous aspect, is that often the way you know that you've gotten this plant, that it causes these lesions, they almost look like straight lines, and they almost look like somebody's whipped you. It's just they're kind of linear, and they can be fairly long on your back, on your arm, depending on where you got it. If your face and you touched your face, there was a case actually, a paternity case, actually became a criminal case in the country. Must have been 3-4 years ago, maybe 5 years ago, where they actually had accused the dad of this 8-year-old girl, 7-year-old, I forgot, for abuse, physical abuse and otherwise. And they were going to court. They were going to have a court case. And the father kept denying that this had happened. He said, I did not do anything. Obviously, there had been maybe some problems in the family. But they were having a court case. And then they called on an expert that said, I wonder, if this was really abuse or has to do, where was the kid when this happened? The father kept saying, I did not do anything, and so forth. And it turns out that the young girl was playing in her backyard. She wasn't wearing any, a T-shirt or anything, so she was, bare, and she was playing in wild parsnip patch. She didn't know. They were rolling around and stuff. And if you would look, and they actually show you in the court, the court case papers that I saw, what the lesions look like. Classic parsnip. So anyway, they investigated, went back to the place where this happened, and sure enough, there was parsnip there. They actually then spoke to the little girl. I should mention, the little girl denied that her dad had done that, had abused her in any way. But, she's 8-year-old, you don't know if they're under pressure. But just to show, so then they did get confirmation from a weed scientist that this can happen, and a medical doctor that was familiar with the plant said, oh yeah, this is exactly what the symptomology is. I mean, who would have thought you would end up in that kind of a situation? But just to tell you, and so, this happens. It's not just to animals. I mean, it's not common, obviously, but just be aware. And so that was the piece that they did for the Syracuse local station there. That was one of the things that I told them. I said, make sure if you think you got wild parsnip, that you tell the medical attending doctor that it's wild parsnip and not necessarily poison ivy, if you know the difference. Because the treatment is a little different. It's dermatitis, but it's a little different. And most medical doctors wouldn't even know. Even at meal. Poison ivy, they have a feel, but wild parsnip. So I want to make sure you guys by Wednesday, the Tuesday group, Wednesday group, you know what this wild parsnip is if you don't know what it is. So you can alert, and it's in ditches, it's everywhere. It's expanding in New York State. Okay? There's ragweed. Okay? You probably have seen this. This is where the pollen's coming from, right here. This is the male part of the plant. Okay? So this is, it's a nondescript plant. Doesn't have very showy flowers. It's just this. You'll see it along the first, you go any highway, the first half foot along, off the gravel, off the asphalt, it's ragweed. I guarantee you. I've done enough work along highways with this thing. Ambrosia artemisifolia. And let me just note this. When you'll have to write the scientific name, note that it's 2 eyes. Artemisifolia. Okay? Just you might want, oh, it's minor, but just, you remember it now. That's the pollen grains. Okay? And with climate change, some of the studies coming out of Maryland that have worked on pollen and ragweed, the plants with increasing CO2 and temperatures are going to produce more pollen. That's clear, and it's just going to be much more aggressive. So anybody that has asthma or health issues related to respiratory issues, this is going to be a major problem. Do you guys know how you get allergies from ragweed? Okay, a little medical thing. Okay, here's ragweed right now. The pollen's flying all over the place. What happens, it gets for those people that are susceptible, and again, about 10% of the population, really bad. Some, it's not a big case. The body starts producing, recognizes it as being foreign, and that it's, a danger, and starts producing antibodies. Okay, the antibodies attach to these cells in the sinuses that are in tissues that are called mast cells. And so when they then come in touch, okay, these antibodies with new pollen that comes in, your body starts basically producing histamine, okay, a protein to fight it off. That's why you take antihistamines, because the histamine starts giving you all this, the running nose, the eyes, itchy eyes, the whole, swelling, that congestion feeling. That's the protein, histamine. Folks that are not susceptible, it doesn't happen. The question is, why do some people, who knows, just like poison ivy. Some people can touch the stuff and nothing happens. Good number of people it does, okay? So this is going to be a major climate change in health, climate change in agriculture. These are going to be some of the issues that people are looking at. So always kind of be on the know as to what might be happening, okay? Poison ivy. Three-leaved, okay, glossy, it can climb up trees, it produces these white berries. Again, if you go to the vet college, the poisonous plants garden that the plantations folks maintain, that's what it looks like. This is poison oak, okay, for some of you who might not be familiar. So if you're unsure, just like mushrooms and stuff, don't touch them. You're better off, okay, toxicodendron. Okay, let me say a little bit about this parasitic plant. Okay, there's a few minutes. Something called striga or witchweed. How many of you have heard of it? I mean, or at least know more than the first time I mentioned in last class. Okay, major parasitic weed in Africa, Southeast Asia. Okay, by the time you see the plant come out of the ground, the damage has been done. Everything occurs below ground. Okay, and striga, and we do have some of it. It's a parasitic weed. It does not photosynthesize. It drains the monocots. It only affects monocots, grasses. And most of our crops, sorghum, millet, and so forth, corn. Okay? And we'll talk a little bit about that. That's what some of the plants look like. Sorry, the main one that we have is Hermontheca. Striga Hermontheca asiatica. It is in the Carolinas. And it was in Alabama. There's a quarantine there. And we'll talk about that when we get in control. Basically, nothing can come in, nothing can come out. It was actually a graduate student from India working at NC State that recognized, was walking some fields, and I think it was in the 50s or 60s, and recognized the plant because back home in India, it's a common problem. And said, yeah, that's striga. And of course, there had been, no one had ever identified it in the United States. It was the first time. We don't know how it came in. But after that, boy, the USDA got on top of it, and they've been under quarantine, certain areas, and they're trying to shrink the acreage because this is bad news. And this is the example I was telling you, that is a concern also to security in the United States in terms of just this plant could cause real issues if you'd spread it in the Midwest and in major corn growing areas. Okay? It's like a fungus in a sense. It produces, okay, the germling looks like a little, seedling that's growing, and what it does is it consents, okay, the seeds of your crop. Okay? It basically, through chemical communication, it can know that there's a corn plant growing or a corn seed, and basically will colonize it. Okay, as soon as the seedling of corn or millet starts growing, it attaches, just like a fungus does. It has a hyphae, just like if you know your basic plant pathology, in the same kind of way, it starts attaching. Okay, and so these are the striga seeds. This is under microscope. These are microscopic. You wouldn't be able to see them with the naked eye. Okay, very, very problematic. Okay? This is what it looks like in a crop. And again, I said beautiful plants. You think, wow, this is beautiful. These sorghum and whatever's there, you're done. 80 to 90% yield reduction, guaranteed. And with 500,000 seeds produced with dormancy, major issues. So a lot of work is going into that. And part of my work when I was in Canada, we found a biological control agent that I'll talk about when we cover biocontrol. It's actually a fungus that basically cuts the communication between the striga and the seed of the corn. That basically says, hey, there's no corn seed here. There's no millet seed. Don't try to attach to it. And it just sits there, which is not a bad thing, okay? a bad thing to do. One thing I want to show you, and I'll talk about this next class, but I want to end with this, as to why you guys are in this class, and I had mentioned this, why it surprises me that we don't have pretty well everybody in CALS that's going to be anywhere near agronomy or natural areas management that does not complete a weeds course because of this number right here, okay? Estimated annual losses due to different pests in the U.S., and this is the same around the world, so it's not just a U.S. phenomena, okay? Diseases, insects, nematodes, weeds, okay? This is the loss, okay, in billions of dollars in general for crops, okay? And I'm trying to remember if we include turf in here and so forth, but let's think in the big picture. So obviously diseases, insects, they're up there, 5.2 billion, it's serious stuff. And again, anybody who's had diseases, and just looking at my tomatoes dying out of, blight right now, I know it. Nematodes, weeds, and you'd say, well, yeah, sure, losses caused. Where the three subdisciplines differ and why it is critical for you to understand where you're going to be putting a lot of money and efforts is in control. Look at the money that is spent in trying to control weeds relative to other pests. And why is that? Look at that. 15.5 versus 0.6. That's where the 19.6, 60% of all pest management costs, whether it's losses or control, is due to weeds. Okay? So how do you explain this 15.5? Let's not worry too much about the number, but it just gives you a sense. Why is it that you're putting all that money for weeds?
Because the potential for loss is a lot higher.
The potential. Again, not to say that you wouldn't get an epidemic of a pest coming in, because when they come, they're going to wipe you out. I've always said this, in 2 weeks, you're done. And we covered that in the IPM course, how important it is for diseases, for example. You don't have much time to react. Weeds, they're going to be there. But at the same time, weeds are going to be there. They're going to be there. So you have to control them no matter what you do. A pest, maybe this year isn't, you're not going to have a particular, disease just because the weather is not as, conducive to that disease development. Not that it wouldn't be a problem, but some years it could be devastating. But it's, as I told you last class, I have not been in a situation where somebody says, you know what, this year I'm not spraying. There's no weeds going to be here. I'm comfortable. It's not going to happen. Unless you want weeds in there, that's fine. Okay? And that is why you guys should be aware of that, and why people that are going to be hiring you down the road, they're going to want this skill from you, at least that you have an understanding of it. Again, some of you are going to work in the vineyard or grape industry. Weeds are not the #1 problem. Absolutely not. It's going to be diseases, and it's going to be, insects and so forth. Absolutely. There's no question there. But as an overall, though, understanding, I think, is valuable. And that's what I want to leave you with these kind of numbers. Again, don't worry about the specific numbers, what they mean, and I wouldn't ask you what is the, percentage control, but just the big picture as to why that's critical. Okay? So reminder, we're going to have, for the Tuesday group lab, let's meet up at Muncher. If any of you know that you might be able to